Hi everyone, Tom here from Speedtech Performance. Thanks for having a look at our video today. The goal of the video here today is to show how our independent front suspension is assembled. So this would be applicable to any of our extreme subframes or extreme chassis. So this will have our custom chassis or custom subframe, custom made lower arms, tubular upper arms, our forged 7075 aluminum spindle with C7 bearing, steering arms, and the sweet manufacturing dual power rack. Currently our instructions are going through some changes, and for an extreme front subframe you would get an independent front suspension instruction set, and for a chassis, like an extreme chassis, you would get independent front suspension assembly instructions, plus a rear torque arm or IRS assembly instructions specific to your vehicle. And the reason for that, in part, is because all of the independent front suspension stuff is more or less going to be assembled the same way. The length of the arms might be different, might be some few specific things to your vehicle here and there, but for the most part the assembly is going to be the same in the front end from one vehicle to another. So let's begin. In the instructions towards the front, there'll be a couple of pages that have a hardware check-in list, so you can check in your order and make sure you have everything before you start. At the same time you're doing this, you may want to lay everything out on the table, and you can put your parts that go together in the same area on the table, and be sure you have everything and make it easy to find as you go through the build process. When you get started with your chassis, you will want either a flapper or a file or maybe even a drill bit just to clean off some of the excess powder coating that you might find causing interference on the holes for some of the fixings. So just take your time, go around the whole chassis. Anywhere where a fixing needs to be put through the chassis, just grab one of your bolts, check it. If it doesn't fit, open it up a little bit with, like I said, either a file or a flapper or even a drill bit where necessary. But it shouldn't be too bad. It should go pretty quick. If you take the time to do it, you won't be as frustrated as stopping in the middle of trying to assemble something. So the main points are going to be the control arms, upper and lower, shock mounts, upper and lower, which will include mounting the shock to the lower control arm. So just check all of those spots, make sure everything's clean before you get started, and make everything go a little bit better for you. Also, there are a couple of tapped holes for the bump stops on the front A-arms as well as the bump stops in the rear. Those are the only tapped threaded holes, and we do put bolts in those to keep them from getting contaminated with any powder coating. But they may need to be cleaned up as well. So once you have that cleaned up, we can start the build, and step one will be installing the bump stops. And then you can lubricate the shanks on your bolts for the front lower control arms. Put the arm into the pocket for the pivot point and slip the bolts through front and rear. The threads as well can be lubricated here, although in other parts of the build we'll want to make sure we keep the thread lubricant just on the shank and not on the threads. A lot of these bolts are in high vibration areas. We do use nylocks and stovers, but in some cases we'll use red Loctite as well. So make sure you use all the appropriate washers and hardware when assembling. All of that is called out in the written instructions. Okay, now we're ready to hang the front shocks from the top pivot point on the chassis, and you'll have a tapered spacer that goes on each side of the spherical bearing. When you put the shouldered bolt through, always put the bolt through from the back towards the front, and the reason for this is because there is a location where you can mount a down bar that'll go over to the firewall. So if you don't put this upper shock bolt through from the back side towards the front, then that bolt would be trapped and you would have to remove your down to before you could get the shock off in the event that it would ever need service or an adjustment or change a spring or anything like that. So keep an eye out for that. Here again you see the shock bolt going through from the back to the front. Again, thread lubricant on the shank of the bolt, but keep the threads dry. We want to make sure that these threads get good engagement with red Loctite or the nylock itself. So now we have the lower arms in, we have the shocks on, and we can go around and torque everything. So the lower arms will come to you assembled, and we have two Delrin bushings, total of 4 Delrin bushings, 2 in the front pivot, 2 in the rear pivot, and then there's a steel sleeve that goes through the Delrin bushings, and that's actually what you'll torque against. So you don't have to be at ride height to torque these. You can torque these while they're in the air, and the Delrin pivots around that steel sleeve that goes through the 2 bushings. Go ahead and torque up your shocks at the same time. So the next step will be to hang the spindle on the lower ball joint. You can go ahead and rest the spindle down. They are lefts and rights. The caliper will mount to the rear and the steering arm will mount to the front. But before you put the steering arm on, you're going to want to put the spindle on the lower ball joint. It's no problem to go ahead and put the spindle on the lower ball joint now. Use the washer and the castle nut. And it doesn't have to be tightened right now, but then you can work on your upper A-arms. So go ahead and lubricate the shanks on the bolts for the upper A-arms. And then you'll slip the arm over those bolts, and you can put your washers and nuts on. Don't forget your caster washers. So one just fell out there, you'll see that. If you just use the center one, your caster is probably going to be fine for a street car. If it's something that you do plan to autocross or road race, you may want to add a little bit more caster, but you should be fine just using the center hole for the caster washer. You put the nuts on, drop the top ball joint into the spindle, run your castle nut down by hand. Then you can install your camber shims. A 1/8 inch camber shim should give you about a ½ degree negative camber in the front, which would be pretty much perfect for the street. So like I said, the center caster washer and a single 1/8 inch shim for caster, and you'll see our technician here is just going to run that nut down a little bit so nothing's too loose. So when he puts the shim in, it'll stay. And once he runs those nuts down a little bit, he will install the shims, and then he'll finish tightening that and torque it to the appropriate torque specified in the instructions. So there you see the shim going in, and then he's not using his gun for final torque, he's just using the gun to run the bolt through that nylock to snug it up a little bit. And we'll put the rear shim in. Same thing, snug it up, and we'll come back and torque that. Now we can go ahead and tighten the spindle castle nuts. So the torque spec is in the instructions. 80 pounds for the lower, 50 pounds for the upper. Once you click that off with your torque wrench, if the hole for the castle nut doesn't line up enough that you can get your cotter pin in, you can just go ahead and you can increase the torque on that. You turn it a little bit more. Never back it off. Don't ever loosen it up. But it's okay to turn it forward a little bit more so that you can get your safety pin in there and you don't have your nuts at risk of backing off. So we've got the lowers and uppers and in, we've got our coilover on, we've got our upright in, and now we can move on to steering. We'll install the steering arms on the spindle next. It's held on with 2 bolts and 2 stover nuts. Use the washers where applicable, and you'll also want to use thread lubricant on the shank of the bolt, just in case you ever need to take those bolts out again. You wouldn't want them to be corroded in place from either the aluminum oxidizing or the steel bolt getting any corrosion on it. So if you just put some thread lubricant on the shank of the bolt, that'll help ensure you can get those out. We do use red Loctite on the threads, so be careful not to get any thread lubricant on the threads for your steering arm. And once you push it through, then you can add the red Loctite, put your stover nuts on, and those can be torqued down. And the corners of the car are more or less built now. So we will move on to installing our 3-piece sway bar. We use a 3-piece sway bar, which consists of a bar and then 2 lever arms on each end, 1 on each end. You can start by sliding the sway bar into the chassis, into the integrated tube for the sway bar. And then we'll get our couplers, bushings. We'll get our bushings, and with the grease fittings pointing down, we will push those bushings into place. They may need to be tapped in just a little bit. It should be a nice clean fit, and it might be just a little snug where you need to tap it in with a mallet. But again, this shouldn't take any significant effort to push these bushings in. Put the sway bar in before you put the bushings in. So you can see we had to tap that in a little bit, but no significant effort to push those in. So now we'll fit our lever arm. The first lever arm doesn't really need to be indexed. It can just go on as long as the arm is on top of the lower control arm so that it can be mounted. You wouldn't want to trap it on the bottom side. So as long as it's on the top side, that's fine. It doesn't need to be indexed. So then when you go to install the other side, you'll just want to make sure you get those 2 arms as closely aligned as possible. Now you may not be able to perfectly align these to one another, but get them as close as you can, and then when you set your drop links, they'll be virtually the same length, which would be ideal for your setup. And you can check the offset from side to side by rotating it up or rotating it down, and just checking that the arms approximately clocked the same from side to side as you see here. And if you're not sure, you can always pull it back off of one side, and you can try to move it up or down a single spline and see how much that moves your arm, and if you were closer before or after, and then just target the closest that you can get. So go ahead and assemble your drop links, which is 2 spherical bearings, 1 male thread, 1 female thread. Run your jam nut up the male, then you can thread the 2 spherical bearings together. For the lower bearing, you'll need a couple of tapered spacers, kind of like the ones that we had on the shock absorbers. And the upper has the shoulder integrated into the spherical bearing. And then you can install that with your tapered spacers on the arm. The lower silver spherical bearing will mount to the lower control arm. Then you can position the sway bar to accept the upper heim joint and run the bolt through the holes and just hand tighten everything for a minute. You can tighten that up, and then we can do the other side. So these are going to be about the same length side to side, and what you may even want to do is leave one side loose, tighten up the other side, and then once you actually have the car on a level surface, on the ground, on the wheels, after it's aligned, you can go ahead and set the length of that, and it should slip right through the heim joint and into the sway bar with no resistance at all. And if you do have any resistance, then that's what that adjustment is for. You can turn those two heim joints on each other, and you can lengthen and shorten that drop link. But you shouldn't have any preload on your sway bar when you're standing on level ground with the car. So for the purposes of assembling it and our demonstration here, we're going to go ahead and tighten these up. All of our Extreme chassis and Extreme subframes use a Sweet Manufacturing dual power assist steering rack. The three holes in the front of the front cross member will receive the steering rack. You can go ahead and prep your bolts with some red Loctite and install the rack onto the chassis. These are 1/2-inch fine thread bolts. They can take a torque of 75 pounds. And you can just go ahead and run those down, torque those up right away. The two threaded studs coming up off of the rack, those are going to take our tie rods. So we'll just pull the nuts off and those spacers, and we'll put the tapered spacer down first, and that's what our tie rod will sit against. Go ahead and assemble your tie rods. You'll have a couple of heim joints, and then you'll have a buckle. Well, basically the steel silver piece with the hex on it. It'll have left-handed threads on one part of it and right-handed threads on the other part of it, making it a bit of a turnbuckle. Now the arms do have a little bit of a bend and are kink in them, and that should be aligned with the arm, with the outside of the bend to the back of the car. So we set the tie rod on the steering rack. You run your washers, your spacers, and your nut down, and we'll come back and torque those once we get everything going here. So on the lower, you're also going to have a tapered spacer, just to keep that heim joint free and able to move. And then you put a small washer and another tapered washer on top. And again, if you wanted to adjust your bump steer, you can. However, in most situations, you're going to find if you just follow the instructions, the setup is going to be ideal for most any driving situation, even competition. Okay, we'll torque our inner and outer tie rods. I'm not giving you all the torque specs because sometimes we change things, and I don't want to give you the wrong information. So always check your instructions for the latest and greatest in terms of torque specs. The shouldered bolts won't take quite as much as a bolt, because that shoulder bolt's going to have a smaller thread on it than what a standard bolt would. Okay, so there you have it. Now, basically the front end is all assembled. We'll go ahead and finish installing the brakes here, checking that the rotor is centered within the caliper, and we'll get all of that set up. I'm not going to go into the detail of that because you'll get that with your brake kit. And please follow the brake kit manufacturer's instructions for installation. Keep an eye out for part 2. In part 2, we will build up the Ford 9-inch rear end and install the rear end and torque arm. So we'll make a part 2 to this video, and that will be a complete chassis build. Alright, thanks everybody for having a look with us on building up the front suspension of our Extreme chassis on this Tri-5. Our next video will include similar instructional detail on assembling the rear end. And anything else that you guys have questions on or are curious about, leave us a note below, drop a comment below, and we'll try to cover that off for you. You can always give us a ring on the telephone. Also follow our social media on Facebook, Instagram, and we even have a TikTok account going now. So we got plenty of things going on the interweb. So if you're a current customer, you already have some Speedtech stuff on your car, or you're going to be purchasing a Speedtech system here in the near future, you might want to jump onto Facebook and look for Team Speedtech. Team Speedtech is a group for Speedtech customers. We also have a lot of our dealers participate there, and people within the company, including our technicians and our sales team and even the owners and the marketing department. Everybody is on Team Speedtech. If you have any questions about assembling your product or building the next step on your car, if maybe you've done a front end and you're curious about rear end, you're curious about some of the other product, any sort of Speedtech product questions or installation questions, or even setup once it's all built, and you've got questions about the alignment. Do you want to run toe in? Do you want to run toe out? Do you want to run a half a degree of camber or a full degree of camber? It just depends on what you're doing with the car. There's lots of people that participate in the Team Speedtech group, and everyone's really supportive. So if you have any questions, you can always get help there. And of course, we're here as Speedtech. We're here for you as well. So if there's any questions, you can always just give us a ring. There's so many different places to get information these days. We're happy to help, and Team Speedtech on Facebook is a great place to get support from other people in the car community. Thanks for having a look, and look for our part 2 where we build up the rear end, and we'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye.